Good morning, and thank you for joining our webinar this morning. Dave, Poirier, and I are pleased to be able to take some time with you and share some of our thinking and thoughts on how organizations can navigate this very difficult time with major disruption. IISc is a proud sponsor of this webinar. We have a number of partners that work with us. Chapter number one is the IISc chapter that is the formal host and organizer for the conference, for the webinar, but we have a number of other chapters in IISc, Michigan, Indiana, Greater Miami, Virginia, and even a few student chapters that partner with us. And then, of course, the Young Professionals Group in IISc, the Industry Advisory Board, and the Council on Industrial and Systems Engineering. And we're very pleased to have the Association for Corporate Growth from Toronto be a partner with us today also. Just a couple of webinar logistics for you. There will be a webinar recording that will be made available to you after the session. The presentation in PDF form has been loaded in as a handout, and you can download that at any time during the presentation. We will look at your questions as they come in throughout. Maggie will be monitoring those and share those with Dave and I via chat, and if time permits and as appropriate, we'll weave those questions in. And then follow-up questions, if you have follow-up questions, we'll provide contact information at the end of the webinar that lets you know how to get a hold of us. So the storyline for today, and a little bit of background. So Dave and I have worked together for over 30 years, and we've worked with a number of organizations, many organizations, I would say. And those organizations have been in different conditions. Some were in distress, some were doing great. And over 30 years, there have been many different types of situations that we've encountered as we've worked with the variety of organizations. I would say, Dave, that probably this is an unprecedented condition for organizations, and I think that Dave and I felt that our accumulated sort of experiences and insights around how to manage organizations in different situations and different conditions might be useful for some of you. Dave, any thoughts on background and what our motivation for doing this was?
Well, certainly as we look around, we see a lot of organizations that are struggling with being a little bit on their heels and having difficulty getting their arms around the current situation and planning forward. There's so much disruption and there are so many points of uncertainty around this. It's very difficult to use traditional planning and traditional management techniques to be able to navigate our way through these things successfully. And I think we've seen some great examples of where that does work and where you can change and adapt traditional tools in order to help you manage through this. And we want to talk about some of them today.
So the storyline is these 6 points, actually just 5 major points. And the first one we'll start with is a term called Black Swan, which I'm sure most of you have heard about. We'll define Black Swan event in just a second here, but just as look at a timeline for the last 30 or 40 years, you can see examples of Black Swan events. And of course, every time that we have a major event or a major disruption, there's an impact on the economy. And the thing that we overlaid on top of this timeline of major disruption, so to speak, is sort of these eras below. So there's a field called resilience, the science of resilience, resilience engineering, and it's closely associated with industrial and systems engineering. We have a very outstanding professor in the department at Ohio State that's a resilience engineering expert. And so when you think about the era of resilience and the era of big disruptions and failures and breakdowns, you think about the era of technology, we think about the era of human errors, think about the era of social technical interactions. And I think now we've entered an era clearly where it's really an era of resilience. So it's an issue of how can we be less vulnerable in relationship to unanticipated situations. So as I said, if you map out the world index, MSCI world index over time, we just use that index as an example of sort of measuring the economic impact of these major disruptions and events. You can see that, again, over time, these events happen and they have an adverse impact on the economy, and then things get better and pick back up again. So I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. So when we think about a black swan event, again, some of you may have heard of it and some not, but it's something that has probably never happened before. Oftentimes black swan events are extremely rare and oftentimes highly improbable. It takes us by surprise, and this one clearly did. In fact, if you look at if you go to YouTube and you look up black swan events, you'll see an interesting YouTube video that was put together back in late 2019, very late 2019, and there was a prediction of the top 10 black swan events for 2020, and this particular event was nowhere on the list, not anywhere on the list. And if you look down through the list of predictions of black swan events, you'll see things like Venezuela does something to create oil prices soaring. Well, what we see is the exact opposite, and Venezuela didn't have anything to do with it. So, again, I think these things take us by surprise. And black swan events carry or have massive transformation impact. Certainly this one has. And it's interesting with these events, in hindsight, you look back and you say, gosh, we should have seen that. We should have been better prepared for that. So I think that's the characteristic of these events. So what we know, and Dave, why don't you run down through this list real quick with people?
Yeah, and I think it's important to start with what you do know and get the facts out there. So what we do know is that we can control how we study, plan, adjust, and move our business along. And we know that there's going to be a front, middle, and back to this storm that we're facing right now. And each one of those phases will require different strategies. And there are upside and downside risks to these situations. Some organizations are doing phenomenally well right now, and many others are really suffering. And there are a mix of threats and opportunities in the front of the storm, and different ones in the middle of the storm, and additional ones in the back of the storm. We're going to talk about some of those, and we're going to walk you through how this really makes sense in various phases, and how to put a little structure to your thinking around this for your organizations, and come up with some plans that are tangible and helpful to your organization.
So we wanted to throw in a quote. I found this. I actually have shared this with my students over the last couple of weeks because, as you can imagine, young people are upset by this. They're frustrated by it. They're emotional about it. They're some of the seniors graduating are going to have virtual graduations. They never thought about having a virtual graduation. So I think that these kinds of inspirational quotes give us some perspective on things. So we thought we'd share that with you at this point in the webinar. So let's migrate now to the next question, or the next point in the storyline. So we are where we are, and we can't change that. And I think that these are, I don't know, when I call them, Dave, I guess I just say they're abstractions, things that shape the way we think about the situation. So chance depends on circumstance, but choice depends on your attitude. Attitude's a choice, obviously. And then, the results that we create as we manage through this difficult time is going to have a lot to do with the attitude that we adopt and the way we think about what's in front of us and how we manage through it. Dave, this next slide, I think, why don't you tell us a little bit about what this means to you and what it's meant to you over your career, and how you've applied this in organizations in different situations and different conditions.
And certainly now we're in these unprecedented times. There's a lot of confusion. People are very uncertain about their personal futures, their company's futures, their community's futures as well. And yet we still have to move forward. And the way that we have to move forward is to be a lot more agile than we have in the past, where the future was more predictable. So we have to do more scenario planning. We have to think about all the potential outcomes that we're facing and have specific plans for each one of those. We have to make sure that we're doing constant measurement and feedback so we can see where we are operating, what's happening on the outside as well as on the inside. And we have to be highly adjustable to the future. And in order to do that, you've got to have alignment and trust within your organization. So creating strategy and policy, rapid deployment, and one of the things we talk about is creating the planning for the future as a separate activity from dealing with the firefighting of today. And it's important that you separate those two. Create those measurement systems. Make sure that you're introducing the language of personal and professional mastery. So living the values and modeling the values, and making sure that the culture of your organization stays intact, and the things that build in integrity and build trust for your organization are at the forefront. And then focus on that communication in a big way. Keep people aligned, keep them linked, and keep them attuned to what has to be done.
Yeah, and Dave and I had our webinar in February focused on how to create a culture that supports operational excellence and supports full potential performance. And it's interesting, Dave, that webinar, at the time we did the webinar, I don't think this was really on our horizon. I don't think you and I were thinking about the disruption being as big as it is here right now in April. So we were talking sort of about how do you create a culture? How do you create a culture where people are living on the right versus living on the left? In other words, not waiting and seeing, not talking about it's not my job, not finger pointing. And so I think many of your organizations out there have very positive and strong cultures. And if that's the case, then build on that. You can build on that as you create your strategies for making the adjustments necessary to survive and thrive through this major disruption. If you're in an organization that hasn't maybe done its homework and it hasn't laid a solid foundation for culture, then this is work that you've got to do in parallel. And it's probably work you got to do sooner rather than later, because if you don't do this work, if you don't make this shift from left to right culturally, particularly when many of our workers are in a virtual environment now, then it's just going to be an anchor. It's going to drag you back. It's going to slow you down. If you successfully can live on the right, then you've got speed of trust. And we're going to talk about speed of trust in a little bit. So I think we wanted to introduce this because while you're developing strategy and policy rapid deployment for making the right kinds of adjustments to survive and thrive, and while you're continuing to build your visible measurement and management systems, you also have to work to continue to either reinforce a strong positive culture or build one.
Right, and Scott, I think we can summarize the left-hand side and the right-hand side of that last chart as saying the left-hand side is really saying, I don't know what's going to happen to me, to my team, to my company, and the right-hand side is I'm going to be focused on making changes that gets me the best outcome possible as a result of my activities.
Right. Yep. So it's sort of a see it, own it, solve it, do it. It's it's an alignment. We get alignment, we get accountability, and then people are focused on doing the right things. But again, we may be at cause do nothing in certain situations because I'm confident, I have trust that somebody else is going to do it, right, Dave?
Yes, absolutely. And that's where that trust is really important, because you cannot have everybody doing everything, and you still have to be able to assign work to individuals who may now be remote from you that used to sit beside you.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. So let's switch to our next storyline point. We want to talk about, Dave and I've given a lot of thought to this. We've been reading a lot of articles about how this is impacting different industries and different organizations in different ways. So we've created this framework. I would call it a framework, sort of a construct. And one is category one would be it's all over. It's a tipping point for us. We were marginal before. We're not going to even make it through 3 months. So then we've just labeled that a phoenix situation, phoenix rising. In other words, we've got to stop, go back, start all over again. Category 2 is what we've called retrench. Dave, how do you envision the retrench category?
These are organizations that are going to survive in the future, but are going through significant impacts to where they are now. So think about movie cinemas, think about sports and entertainment organizations where they're just unable to carry on business right now. And so they're going to hunker back, reduce their costs as much as possible, manage their cash flow, and wait until they can reemerge out the other side. But there is a long-term business model that will still work for them. The third one are really organizations that are adapting and moving through this difficult period by looking for the best opportunities that they have to carry on business and pick up adjacencies. So a couple of examples for this would be some of the restaurants like McDonald's that have now switched to home delivery and takeout instead of eating in, and a number of other retailers like that have created curbside services. Home Depot is an example of that, where they're working to adapt and keep their operations open, keep their employees safe, and be able to serve the customer needs in this difficult time. And we've got other examples in the automotive industry as well, where they're certainly adapting and carrying on business, manufacturing things that they never manufactured before, like ventilators. And then the fourth group are the group that are really thriving, really taking off like crazy. The challenge that they're facing is the unbridled growth that they have. And so the challenge for them is, can they get control of the growth in a way that they can manage their organizations successfully, not only operationally, but financially as well.
Good. So regardless of the condition or situation, there's a process that Dave and I believe you can utilize that'll help you manage through this, navigate through this. And at a very high level, at a very high abstract level, it's response, recovery, mitigation, and preparedness for the next disruption. So we're going to walk you through what this looks like for all four of those different organizational situations or types. But I think it starts, and Dave Dave, I'd like you to speak to this. I think the process of planning for and getting alignment and getting clear strategies for how to manage through the front of the storm, middle of the storm, the back of the storm, it starts with sort of this picture. You want to talk a little bit about this, Dave?
Yes, and later on we're going to talk more about specific tactics to use here. And at the end of this, if you're interested, we can provide you with some to-do lists that are very specific that might be helpful for you. But here it really focuses in on, can you move the organization fast enough to not only respond to the current situation, but to execute the plans in uncertain times ahead, volatility, uncertainty, and challenges that we have facing us. And so it's really about, as leaders, can we pull the organization together and create the courage to move forward, to shift from that, I don't know what's going to happen to me, to I want to create the best future and that I possibly can along with my team. And so collect the organizations together, build a lot of trust, make sure that there's clear purpose, and that you're agile in your plans. You can look at the best case scenario, the worst case scenario, and some middle ones as well. But manage your financial modeling to match those things as well, so that you can ensure that you have the appropriate cash flow, that you're managing the risks going forward, and that you can adapt to the marketplace as soon as you see signals of change to what your current plan is.
So let's migrate to the next point in our storyline, the fourth point, and I think we're making good progress. So if you have questions, then let me encourage you to submit them, and Maggie will monitor them for us, and we'll integrate them in as we're going along if they're appropriate and we have time. So when Dave and I thought about this, we thought about, what can we offer that would help people think through what they might change. To some extent, when we thought about that question, we thought, well, maybe there's a lot of things we don't have to change. So maybe there's a lot of fundamentals that we just need to execute on maybe a little differently, or maybe just a little faster. So I think when it all comes down to, and why I decided to become an industrial and systems engineer, and more specifically what I consider to be an integrated systems engineer, is I think that the path forward for us, regardless of the condition and situation, is the integration is just continuing to focus on recognizing that it's an integration of strategy, process, technology, and people, and that the solution forward, regardless of the conditions that we're operating in, really require us to stay focused on optimal integration of those four things. So that's what we're going to talk about. And the other thing, Dave and I are a big fan of Jim Collins. Some of you may not have even heard of Jim Collins and his book Built to Last and Good to Great, but those two books are two of the most widely read business books ever written. And I think that I think, and then I'll ask Dave to jump in and enhance it. I think that the Good to Great model that Jim Collins presented in the Good to Great book, where we start off with level 5 leadership, and then we focus on who's on the bus, first on who, then on first who, and then what, making sure we get the right people in the right seats in the bus. We're intellectually honest with ourselves. That's really critical right now. Confront the brutal facts. Some of them are not going to be pretty and we're not going to like, but we still have to do that. And we'll talk in a second about the hedgehog concept, what that means, and then the culture, discipline, and then finally innovation accelerators. How, and in particular, for example, how we can use technology enablement to accelerate our ability to innovate. And we're seeing organizations like Zoom, Ohio State. I don't know where Ohio State would be trying to continue to educate 110,000 students without our version of Zoom. It's really enabled us to be able to manage our way through this very difficult time. So what we're trying to do with this model is unlock the flywheel. And Dave and I actually sat in on Jim Collins' presentation for the Young Presidents Organization in Toronto, Canada, a number of years ago. And I had read both books, and I listened to Jim talk, and I was just reminded how many times the word discipline came up. And so, I think that the main theme in both Built to Last and Good to Great is disciplined people, disciplined thought, disciplined action, disciplined thought, word, deed, so to speak. So to me, I think that these are examples where let's not lose sight of some of this great work that's been done, research and foundational sort of principles and methods and concepts about how we manage, regardless of the conditions we're in. What would you add to that, Dave?
Well, I think, I want to comment on the word discipline, because a lot of people think that means buttoning down everything, having a system that's very rigid. And we're not talking about rigid here. I want you to think about discipline in terms of, think of any of the great sports teams that have existed. If you look at them, they're extraordinarily disciplined, but they're not rigid. If they were rigid, they'd be predictable and they wouldn't have won. But they're very disciplined in their approach. And that's what we're talking about here. Organizations that are very much connected, individuals that are very much connected to one another for a common cause and working in collaboration very well. And, one of the interesting things that we've found in recent weeks, particularly in the last 2 weeks, is that management and individuals, many of them are saying that they've never worked harder than they're working right now. And that's really an indication of increased communication and decreased efficiency of communication that we had in working together in operations, where we could collaborate much more easily when we're under the same roof. And so there's more challenges to creating that alignment, creating the trust within the organization that's required to go forward at the speed that we need to go to. And these are the things that Jim Collins talked about in general. when an organization is under pressure the way most of ours are right now, it's really essential for us to get that much better at it. And we're going to talk about that a little more in a few slides.
Right. And it's interesting to note, Dave, that the subtitle, I don't know whether it's a subtitle or just a tagline, but why some companies make the leap and others don't. I think that's another theme that Dave and I want to share with you is, so if you think about think about doom to boom. So we're a Phoenix organization. How do you avoid having to reinvent yourself? Is it possible to go from a 1 to a 2 or a 2 to a 3 or a 3 to a 4? So think about that leap. How do we make sure that as we go through this storm, that if we're a 2, we don't end up going down to a 1 and end up being in a situation where we have to literally shut the doors and reinvent ourselves. So as we said, one is to go back to some foundational thinking, and I think that we can dust off the good to great and build to last. And I think there's a lot of things to learn there and continue to bring that. That's that sort of continuity of principle and continuity of method. I think the second component to this is how do we do this faster? So one of the things we know is that even though the overall strategy for managing through a disruptive period hasn't changed, it's still the integration of people, process, technology, and process. I think, but what I think we find is that again, this goes back to making sure we take advantage of things that are available to us. So Stephen Covey wrote a book called The Speed of Trust. Many of you don't remember. This is actually Stephen Covey's son that wrote this book, was the author of this book. So that conventionally, I think most people think if I've got a great strategy and I execute well, then I'm going to have great results. So, and I think that model, that formula might work in great times, smooth sailing, no big storm. But I think that when you get a big storm, it's really the equation changes and there's a hidden variable. It's strategy times execution times trust equals results. So that we get this accelerator effect. And I think most of you maybe haven't thought of this as a formula, but I think intuitively many of you probably get this. You probably sense, hey, because when I read this at first I thought, well, that's sort of stupid, I mean, I don't know, it's sort of obvious. But then I looked at it and go, that's really profound. There's a lot of truth to that. So that's one observation we would make is that, again, that's why that moving from left to right, moving from the at effect sort of thought, word, deed to at cause, thought, word, deed, so critical.
Yeah, and Scott,
go ahead,
Scott, I just want to chat about that trust as well. So you're hearing trust from us a lot, and I know lots of organizations have it hanging on the wall. It's one of the things that's important to them. In a time of crisis, every advisory firm and consulting firm, including ours, the first thing they would tell you is protect your relationships with your customers and protect your revenue line. The second thing would be protect your relationships with your key suppliers. And the third is protect your relationships with your key employees for the organization. Those are all around trust. And that's why we're emphasizing this trust, that it's extremely important to get out front of that and have the credibility with your customers, do what's right by them. Likewise with your suppliers. And, we're seeing organizations, large retailers like Walmart and various grocery chains that are actually saying, we're going to speed up payment to our smaller suppliers in this time in order to build that trust and help them out and keep them alive, quite frankly. And so it's great to see those kinds of things. We've seen all kinds of examples, and I'm sure many of you are experiencing examples of where organizations are reaching out to build trust with you as well. And on the customer side, absolutely, that open, honest, direct transparency around what's happening, what you can do for them, what you cannot do for them is really critical. And so those are the reasons why we're emphasizing trust so much.
Right. And to me, somebody asked a question about trust, one of the participants. And to me, when I think about trust, the way I sort of operationalize it is, to me, it's sort of like, am I confident what I can count on other people for? So our roles, responsibilities, authority, and accountability clear? Are we aligned on who's doing what? Are we aligned on who's in what seat in the bus and what does it mean to be in that seat, and what can I count on from somebody from the standpoint of just, I would just say, performance in general. To me, that's really the trust factor. And when you think about it that way, then I think the relationship between speed, for sure, becomes a little clearer. You think, Dave?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is why trust is so important in any times, good and bad, because this environment that we're in is the most difficult time to build trust certainly with employees. And if it wasn't there before, and if people felt like they were just there for a paycheck, it's awfully tough to get them to contribute 120% when they're at home, because they don't trust that it's going to serve their highest good. And so getting those factors out, getting people's worry out, getting out this double checking of everything out of your operation will allow you to go faster.
So don't forget, good to great, built to last. Some really great foundational principles and strategies. Don't forget speed of trust. And maybe more recently, don't forget Agile. So we're learning, most organizations are experimenting with Agile. They understand the language. They understand the process. I think more organizations are probably aware of, familiar with, and experimenting with Agile and sprints and retrospectives to speed up things than maybe are familiar with this book, Measure What Matters, by a guy named John Doerr, who did a lot of work with Google and other major organizations over the past 20, 30 years. What are your thoughts, Dave? Because I think you're a fan of this OKR thing. What do you see in this? How do you see it playing in terms of helping organizations speed things up?
Well, the real notion between OKR and the traditional key performance indicators we have in our business is key performance indicators. When you achieve them, they tend to get you to where budget is. In these rare times that we're facing, we know that some areas are not going to be able to achieve their traditional KPIs. And so you need other areas to make up for it and exceed it. So OKRs are about what's possible versus what is budget or what is expected. And so really reach and strive for the what's possible versus what did I commit to at the beginning of the year. And that allows individuals and organizations and teams to exceed expectations significantly and start to build momentum towards success. And the way to do that in this environment isn't to create a plan for the rest of the year that's nailed down and rigid, but to be a lot more agile and therefore requiring a number of scenarios as things unfold in the coming weeks and months.
So just to sort of migrate to summarize, so again, the sustaining performance excellence in periods of major disruption still requires that we integrate strategy, process, technology, and people. I think what does happen, though, is that the requirements for success for those four components change, they shift. So in general, I would say with strategy, there's obviously a need to move faster, to build alignment quicker, to make decisions faster, to develop and create a sense of urgency, almost create a war or front mental model, sense of urgency type of thing. With process, I think what I've seen in the organizations that we work with around Columbus is all the continuous improvement stuff goes on the back burner, because people are either so caught up in catering to crises and fighting fires. If you're in healthcare, there's just no time to work on flow. So we had a major flow project with OSU Med Center. That's all gotten put on the back burner because they're just in survival mode. So process has to shift. Process focus has to shift from fixing the process at a slower pace to reinventing, re-engineering, and just surviving, and just agile and sprinting and just doing stuff really fast. From a technology standpoint, I think it's really interesting because for example, at Ohio State, I think we have a very sound fundamental, strong IT infrastructure, and we're able to build off of that, and we were able to be very agile in responding to this situation. A lot of organizations aren't in that kind of a situation. So if your technology strategy depends on the quality and the robustness and the strength of the infrastructure, the technology infrastructure you're building on. And then finally, I think, like Dave said, I think that because we're in more virtual environment, I think the need to communicate, to stay coordinated, grows. It just expands almost exponentially. And I think that that's a challenge for us, because I think that many of us are just not as skillful at or accustomed to communicating and coordinating in this modality, using this modality. Anything you'd add to how the sort of requirements for success shift for these four components of the overall solution, Dave?
Well, certainly the link between these four is really critical. And somebody had asked, how we ensure strategy execution and trust throughout the supply chain. And that's through visibility, communication, and being able to forecast or look forward. And one of the things that we're seeing with strategy now is, as the economy was doing so well and organizations were doing so well, nobody was really willing to reinvent themselves. There wasn't a need for it, quite frankly. And so there was a lot of focus on continuous improvement. Now things are bad, and it's forcing organizations to change the way they're doing things. But the opportunity in that is you can really start to think about, how would I redesign this? How would we do things differently? And we've got a client right now who's actually had a significant part of their operations shut down. They pivoted within hours to say, here's our opportunity to reinvent how we do things going forward. Let's focus on that right now. And so that pivot, that agility in their strategy is going to be really important for them to make it through. The link between these things is critical, and that emphasis on communication, on feedback, on alignment of individuals, getting them to understand not only the tasks that you want them to do, but the context of those tasks, because you're not going to be there to watch them or answer their minute-to-minute questions.
Yeah. One of the audience members asked, what are your thoughts about utilizing the skills from Lean Sigma to drive reinvention, re-engineering, and Agile? And that's an interesting question. I think on my first reaction to answering that question was that Lean Sigma is just too slow. And I think in general that's true. I think, we think about DMAIC projects and we think about, 3 to 5 month project. Nobody's got time. Nobody's got 3 to 5 months to fix processes right now. We got to fix stuff on the fly. So I think the principles of Lean and Six Sigma, the principles of flow, the principles of reducing defects, of improving quality, reducing variation, those principles still apply. We just have to be faster at doing them. So I don't think that the thinking, the tools, the methods, but I think that in Lean Sigma in general, my experience in most organizations is it's almost, it's a slow mentality. It's just not fast enough. So I do think that we do need to bring Agile, and I think the concept of OKRs, objectives and key results, can accelerate our ability to improve processes rapidly in the face of dramatic needs to create. And a lot of times, Dave, what we're finding is we're trying to create a process that doesn't even exist. So it literally it's designed for Lean Sigma, right?
Yeah, and back to our earlier point where we really think that creating strategies for the future should be a separate group and separate activity in the war room from dealing with today's emergencies and urgencies. And that will enable you to rethink how your business operates rather than being stuck with fixing today's problems.
So, Dave, let's move on to the next point. So, what we want to do is walk you through. How our process, how we are going to apply these principles to sort of help organizations manage through the storm, depending upon which of these four situations your organization happens to be in. So, we're going to use the framework that we decided to use is one that you're probably familiar with, is SWOT, strength, weaknesses, opportunity, and threat analysis. So we're just going to go real quickly through this. So if you're in a Phoenix scenario, Dave, what do you got to do? What are you thinking? What are you doing? And what do you have to do well to be able to manage through the storm if you're in that scenario?
That just says, so the Phoenix scenario is your business is done. And so Alitalia would be a good example of that right now. They were in trouble before this, and then obviously with the airline shut down, they're going to be out of business. And so it's about how much capital can you preserve, how much can you preserve in assets, and then what's going to reemerge as a solution for Italian Airlines. And so it's more about just conserving whatever assets you can within the organization and live your values and honor your people. Make sure that you're going to be, people are going to be proud of your activities, even though the outcome is so negative.
Yep. And so the next scenario 2, is an organization that is what we called in a retrench scenario. So there are clear threats and weaknesses. They probably predominate our thinking and our attitudes, but there are also some glimmer of some strengths and opportunities. What do you have to share with the group about if you found yourself in that situation?
So this is understanding that you do have a long-term business model and plan that'll survive. So make sure that you focus in on cash management as a top priority for the business. Make sure that you're looking after your key assets and resources, whether they be suppliers, customers, and employees or associates, and that you keep them as aligned as you can, and you do what's best for them. You sustain and maintain your brand image as best you can, and create transparency for your stakeholders, including your shareholders, and begin to plan for the future and for the emergence when you do come out of this, to make sure that your recovery curve is as steep as possible.
Yep. And so the third scenario.
So I'm sorry, Scott. Just on that, one of the questions came in is, do you think it's a good time to review the strategic direction of our organizations? So I think in this case, in the retrench, it is. And along with tactics, strategies, adjacencies, that sort of thing, because your business model is likely going to change.
Yep. And so the adapt scenario. So we've got in the adapt scenario, we've got there are some threats and weaknesses, but we clearly see some strengths and opportunities.
So these are organizations that are staying in business right now. They may be down in revenue, but they're adapting to the marketplace to make sure that their customers are taken care of, to make sure that they're preserving the employment of as many of their employees as possible and looking after the whole, and to make sure that they're maintaining their relationships with their suppliers and with their shareholders or stakeholders as well. And so there may be some right sizing and right costing involved in this, and they've got to move quickly and boldly to make the right moves so that they can manage cash flow appropriately, but make sure that you're sustaining the quality, you're sustaining your brand, and that you're doing the best that you can to preserve that revenue line for the organization. And so we've seen a number of organizations do those pivots, the curbside services for retailers, McDonald's doing their takeout, and organizations like Tesla and the other automotive companies pivoting to ventilators and other medical services wherever they can to help out. Organizations like Brooks Brothers, they're building masks now instead of suits. Those kinds of things are where they're pivoting, helping out. It's helping their brand over the medium and long term, but they're also enabling themselves to maintain some of the revenue lines associated with it.
Yeah. And then the fourth scenario where we've got, as you said earlier, Dave, sort of uncontrolled opportunities and uncontrolled growth.
Yeah, so think of video conferencing companies, think of home delivery companies, think of Amazon, organizations like that are going through unprecedented growth. There's a danger associated with that. If they grow too quickly and they're unable to control that growth, they're going to end up in a serious situation, which could put them back to the first level, for example. And so the key for those organizations is how do they maintain control of the business? How do they increase capacity at the same level that growth is? And if they cannot do that, how do they maintain their brand without disappointing their customers or clients? And obviously, quality is extremely important. And at the top of that is taking care of their employees and associates and making sure that they're safe in there as well. So this is very much about being agile and moving very quickly to stay as best they can ahead of the curve.
So then we threw this in because I think we got this from one of the major consulting firms, borrowed this from one of the major consulting firms. We threw it in. It sort of takes those four situations and it adds a layer of complexity, or it just adds in two factors. One is how deep and how long is the industry demand disruption going to be? So on the left side, less depth and less length, shorter. And then to what extent does the disruption impact the business model? So to what extent does it challenge the business model? And we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, just to say that you can see where these circles are sort of positioned. And so this is another thing that I think somebody asked, how do I know which of the four situations I'm in? I think this slide and this thinking, this 2x2, helps you sort of think about where your organization might be.
And I think the important thing with this is, as we talk about the levels 1, 2, 3, and 4, the Phoenix, the Retrench, the Adapt, and Thrive, this is really about the headwinds that all those organizations are facing. So the longer the disruption lasts and the more extensive the disruption is, the greater the threat to the organization to turn it into a phoenix, quite frankly. And so we're all going to be facing headwinds to some degree. It's difficult to know how long those are going to be, but those are going to be pressures pushing us from a 4 to a 3 to a 2 to a 1. And so our requirement is to counteract that headwind by creating opportunities for us to move forward in a way that makes sense. One of the questions that came in is, do you think leadership should be a fighter or an action hero? I think you have to separate those two elements and really be a situational leader in both those areas.
Yeah. And this sort of goes back, Dave, to the earlier question about is this a time to rethink strategy and values and stuff? And again, this goes back to the good to great slide that we showed a little bit earlier, and I'm not going to dwell on this, but we alluded to the Hedgehog Principle. The Hedgehog Principle basically talks about, there's three circles, and we want to be at the nexus of those three circles. So, what is your organization most passionate about? What does what's the purpose of your organization? Why do you exist? Is there alignment around that? Is that clear to people? And then secondly, what are you uniquely able to contribute to the people that you touch? So what are you great at as an organization? What are your core competencies, so to speak? And then finally, what drives the resource engine? What drives your economic engine for the company? So you can ask this question at a personal level. You can ask it at an organizational level. So I do think, Dave, that regardless of whether you're in situation 1, 2, 3, or 4, I think that revisiting this fundamental question and then going through this process of, how do I lead that? How do I create alignment on it? How do I get people to understand it and see how that hasn't changed as we try to navigate through this storm? I think that's important.
Yeah, and I think a lot of organizations are going through those challenges. And, one of the examples is just associations. If any of you belong to associations, many of them traditionally have built their associations around conventions and conferences. And for the foreseeable future, that's not going to be a big part of their business. Yet in the past, it was a big part of their revenue stream. And so those organizations are rethinking how they can connect with their constituents. And that's no different than retailers are going through, or frankly, religious organizations or anything else like that. How do you maintain the connection with your constituents and yet change the way you deliver your products and services?
Yep. So we'll go through this real quickly because we've got a number of things we want to get done before, and we've just got basically we've got 10 minutes left. So one of the things that we also borrowed from another leading consulting firm and we've added to is some just sort of 5 tips that I guess we would suggest. And I'll run through this real quick, and then I'm going to have Dave close out the webinar, and he'll go through his list of tips and suggestions for you to consider. For one, if I were running a business right now, regardless of whether I had 1, 2, 3, or 4, I would create a project management office. I'd create a war room. Dave and I did this at Sears Canada. We had a big grand strategy room where we were basically running the transformation for Sears Canada. We did not succeed at that transformation, but I think everything we did was the right thing to do. So we had good experience with that. We just the conditions were not such that we were able to pull that off. And then I think you have to create a grand strategy. My personal opinion, it's got to be a lot of butcher block paper post-its. It's got to be real. It's got to be living. It's got to be working. People got to be sitting in that room talking about it. You got to work across multiple time horizons, and I'm going to show you something on the next slide. McKinsey suggested this, and I agree wholeheartedly. I think you got to create a bunch of integrated master plans that somebody owns. You've got owners for each integrated master plan, major project. And then I think you've got to apply Agile, Sprint, Kaizen mentality to your approach, the execution on it. So when McKinsey talked about multiple horizons, these were the horizons they spoke to. So this week, 2 to 4 weeks, 1 to 2 quarters, 1 to 2 years, and then what's the next normal look like? When is that going to be, right? And so then you've got a number of sort of fronts, so to speak. So these blue bars represent fronts or clusters of activity that we're working on. So we got to figure out the initial state and the context. We got to think that through. And so in each one of these cells here is going to be, so what's the initial state? What's the context look like right now? In 2 to 4 weeks, what's it look like, and so forth. So that's what I mean by a war room. This would literally be up in a war room. You'd be sitting there, and you can very visually, and people are adding post-its, taking post-its down. We've got measures of performance up that we're looking at. So the other thing I'd say as I tee up for Dave to close this out is that I really like a book by a guy named Charles Lindblom who said the art and science of muddling through things. And, I think with a lot of times as I'm teaching students, I think that students have a habit of muddling through, meaning they don't ask for help. They don't use the resources around them. They haven't learned yet how to leverage people and things to help them be successful. Sometimes they've got this mentality, I want to do it on my own. I need to do it on my own. So I think the other thing Dave and I would encourage you to do is don't muddle through it. And so I threw in, this is sort of a Peter Senge slide, I think we need a lot more triple loop learning, right? So single loop learning is, are we doing the right thing? So we take actions, we look at results, and we see what the results are created. Double loop learning is we go back and we retest our assumptions. So that's sort of scenario thinking. And triple loop learning is we go back and we actually ask ourselves fundamental questions. How do we decide what the right things are? So I just think that in this time, it almost sounds like we're slowing things down. And I think in terms of thinking, we sort of are. We're doing a different kind of thinking. And so what Dave and I sort of want to I want to get through this one and then get to Dave so he can do his cap off. And we've talked about these 4 different situations: Phoenix, retrench, adapt, and thrive. And so we've got examples over on the right: Zoom, Amazon, Tesla, Bauer, life sciences industries, Disney, dental. And then down at Phoenix, any organization, regardless of the industry you're in, if you were marginal before the disruption and can or won't reinvent, haven't or won't or didn't reinvent, then you're in that category, right? So it doesn't make a difference what industry you're in. You can be at Phoenix. And so the choice really is up to you in terms of how you lead, how you manage yourself through the front of the storm, the middle of the storm, and the back of the storm. So you can either go from doom to boom or boom to doom. And that's sort of the closing comment I'd make. And if you muddle, if you choose to muddle, and you don't think it through and you don't use the resources available to you, then you're more likely to go from boom to doom than doom to boom. So let's just stop now, Dave, and let you sort of sum it up for us in the last 7 minutes here. 5 minutes.
Yeah, I really think these 5 words mean a whole lot to being successful. I mean, you want to make sure that you're staying agile. It's not about being precise. It's about being agile, about moving forward all the time. Very much the characteristics of a startup organization that's just received funding. So there's a very tight time frame. It feels like it's the impossible that you're facing, and you scramble and move forward as quickly as possible, pivot when you need to, but always making progress. And so these 5 words are around communication. Make sure that there's enormous efforts on communication, both inbound and outbound, that there's alignment so people are understanding what the current situation is, what the next steps are, and what the vision is of the future timeframes that Scott spoke about earlier. Create visibility so you can understand and get feedback on how you're doing, how much progress you're making, whether it's working or not, what the market is saying about your organization, and refine to your organization. And then build accountability so that everybody understands what they're accountable for. They feel that sense of accountability and really want to achieve it. They can exceed 100% input by embracing that accountability and taking responsibility for results. And then the last word around discipline. Again, not being rigid, but having an organization that's disciplined like a highly successful sports team, and making sure that you have that perseverance to always follow through. We have some other specific examples that we want to talk to you about, and key tips and considerations, and we will share some more lists with you if you're interested. Just let us know. Scott, you want to take us through this?
Yeah. So I think I'll just throw this up. You all have the ability to download the deck so you can see this. We'll let you read through this list of 7 things that Dave and I came up with. I'm not going to walk through it point by point. I think that what I'd like you to do is, if you have questions about this list, we have other things that we can send you. There are ways that you can access these follow on, ask us questions. So we've got top 10 tips, things to do, and so forth. For additional resources in the deck, you'll be able to get to that link. I want to thank IISc for hosting this. We appreciate IISc is the professional society for the industrial and systems engineers. You can go to their website, lots of great stuff there. We'd encourage you to consider becoming a member. I want to let you know that we've got a follow-on webinar to today coming up on the 16th of April with Jim Tompkins, President and CEO of Tompkins, a past president of IISc, and Dave again, and this says he's president-elect, but Dave is actually president as of April 1st of IISc. So we're glad that Dave has decided to spend more time with us than you on the 16th. And then on the 22nd, a special treat, in my opinion, we're going to talk about principles and tools, and this goes back to that question that was asked about Lean Sigma. So I think there's a lot of tools in industrial engineering and in Lean Sigma that are applicable even in times of trouble. And so we've got 3 really neat projects that these 3 students have been working on at Grange Insurance, Sutphen, which manufactures fire engines, and then Columbus City Schools. So I think you'll be interested in hearing what they've been able to do with these organizations. And again, if you want to follow up and you have questions about the list of 7 questions, if you want information, if you want those checklists, this is how you can get a hold of us, and we'd encourage you to do that. And thank you very much for taking time to participate today. Dave, thank you for your time. Any closing comment?
It's a pleasure, and we certainly wish you all well in going forward. If there's any advice we can give you or help that you need, please let us know. we're glad to speak further with you. And thank you for the opportunity of listening to us.
Thank you, David. Thanks, Maggie.